Well, good morning, everybody. I know lunch is coming up, so I will try to be succinct in all of my comments. Thanks very much for having me here. This presentation is a kind of a redo of one that I did in the fall at the ASN conference in Drayton Valley. So what I would like to talk to you about today is about our association, the Mayatan Lake Management Association, why we were formed, how we transitioned from a one-issue group into a Lake Stewardship Group. Talk about the struggle that we had to prevent some what we felt were large and inappropriate developments around Mayatan Lake, and talk a little bit about what we learned from that whole process and some of the challenges that we have found. Many of you have probably never heard of Mayatan Lake. It is a small lake west of Edmonton, east of Mayatan Lake, and it's in an area where there are a number of small lakes that are little pothole lakes. This is a geologist telling me this is on the edge of where the last ice age formed, so a lot of dirt got piled up and all these little lakes were formed. So Mayatan Lake is 68 kilometers west of Edmonton. It's in Parkland County, and the area around Mayatan Lake has been designated by the county as an environmentally significant area. It's part of what is called the Modeste Creek Watershed, which in turn is a sub-watershed of the North Saskatchewan River. It's a small lake. It has very little to no inflow or outflow. It's a small lake. It's fairly secluded, and the riparian area around the lake is in pretty good shape for the most part. There's a lot of migratory and nesting birds on this lake. And there's a number of wildlife corridors that go in and around the lake. There's large game that goes around the lake. And it's a relatively good lake for fishing, I've been told. As far as development around the lake, there is very little, with the exception of a subdivision which is called Mayatan Lake Estates, which was built in the 1980s. It's a subdivision with about 45 lots, but only about 12 houses. So there isn't a lot of people around the lake. So that's a picture of what the lake looks like. You can see in the background there's a field that was cleared at one time. That's really the only area right around the lake that is farming. Most of the lake is fairly wild and intact and treed in and around and close to the lake. Now our association, the Mayatan Lake Management Association, I found Leah's discussion about names to be very interesting. We had a little bit of discussion about what kind of a name we should have. Why did we form? Well, in November of 2010, a local developer came forward with an open house proposing to develop a 200-site RV park. There was a lot of people attended that meeting. There were a lot of concerns by local residents about it. And about a week later, we held a public meeting to decide how we were going to deal with this. And the outcome of that meeting was that we decided that we should form an association as a vehicle for expressing our collective concerns. So we did that. We formed the Mayatan Lake Management Association, which was incorporated under the Societies Act in late 2010. The goal of the association: protect and preserve Mayatan Lake for the enjoyment of current and future generations. We started out with about 20 people, and we are now at about 100 people. So when we first started, we were a one-issue group, I would say, essentially. We learned very early on, though, that there's a need for watershed management. And I would say that I typified many of the people in our association to say that we didn't really know anything about watershed management, but that at some point, fairly early on in the next few months, we were going to meet the person or the group inside the province that knew all about lakes and that could instruct us and educate us and guide us along the way. And that is something that I will talk about later on. So we formed a watershed management committee in January of 2011. And we started looking around for people who could help us. One of the first groups that we talked to was the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance. What we found out through discussions with them was that there's not a lot of data known about Mayatan Lake, and so it made a natural fit to say, let's look as a first step at developing a state of the watershed report for Mayatan Lake. We were fortunate to get some funding from the Alberta Stewardship Network, and we were extremely fortunate to have Dave True and his staff work with us to develop this state of the watershed report. That was finished in 2012, and the report is on the NSWA website. So you can take a look at it there. And it's an excellent report. So some of the findings that came out of that study: Mayatan Lake is really not a lake, it's a series of small bodies of water, but the way they describe it is that it's a large lake and wetland complex, and with above ground and underground water flow. They confirmed that there's not a lot of data available about the lake. There was some research done back in 1985, but not much since then. The report says that the lake is susceptible to changes in land use. Part of the lake is very deep, part of it is very shallow. The water in the lake is in reasonable shape at this point, but small changes could make a big change in the lake. And they confirmed that the shoreline is minimally disturbed. They had a number of recommendations in the report. One was to conduct water quality monitoring, so we've been doing that since 2011, actually working with the ALMS group to do water testing in the lake. We did it again last year, and we will do it again this year. Do an updated phosphorus budget. The State of the Watershed report did an initial budget of the phosphorus, and there's a recommendation to do more research and keep that up. Investigate, as I said, the groundwater and surface water interactions. There's a feeling that we don't really know what's going on underneath the surface, but there's probably a lot of inflow and a lot of outflow. So that's a research project which is crying out to be done. Developing and monitoring lake health indicators, address some of the gaps in the report, encourage stewardship activities. We do a number of things around the lake now. We have educational seminars at public meetings. We've had a number of public meetings over the last year. We are doing a lake shore and road cleanup annually now, which has been quite successful. And then the last bullet is to develop a watershed management plan. So that's the focus of our activities coming up this year. One of the things we want to make sure we do right at the front end is to get the major players on board. So that's obviously the county, the province, the NSWA, and scientific community. We are planning to do a small project to repair some damage to the riparian area, the one area where it was farming. There's been some damage done there. So that we will do that probably this summer. We're going to continue with the lake testing, the lake cleanup, and our education program, and we're going to work hard to get this lake management, watershed management plan underway. Now, we spent a lot of time over the last year. I want to come back to this issue of the RV park. We were doing work with the NSWA, but at the same time, we were spending a lot of energy around this issue of the proposal to develop an RV park. In 2011, the developer got a bylaw amendment passed by Parkland County, which allowed him to go ahead. It had to do with road setbacks and so on. There was a public hearing there. We made presentations at that. We weren't successful in getting that bylaw amendment turned down. And then in 2012, in August, the Parkland County Municipal Planning Commission conditionally approved a development permit for this site. So we as an association and a number of local residents appealed that decision to the Parkland County's Subdivision and Development Appeal Board. And we had a number of reasons for appealing that decision. First of all, we presented evidence, scientific evidence, that indicates that the lake will be harmed by this size of development. And we had a number of people that gave us good information. We brought in Dr. David Chinler from the University of Alberta, who gave a very strong presentation to say that these small lakes in Alberta are fragile. When you have development around them, you have to be extremely careful about how you do that, because even things like animals running around in the riparian area will add to the load of nutrients, which can have an effect on the lake. We looked at the issue from a legislative point of view, and we made the case that there were a number of conflicts between putting this development in and legislation, particularly from Parkland County. So we looked at the Parkland County Area Structure Plan for Mayatan Lake, which is about 30 plus years old and is out of date, and it doesn't really reflect a lot of the new environmental thinking that Parkland County has in place. And we've also asked the county to update that area structure plan on several occasions. We looked at the application itself. There were a number of things that we took issue with, and we focused on things like water management, sewer management. We looked at the roads going in and out and the ability or inability of those roads to carry the traffic. And we looked at a number of issues around enforcement and things like fire and police coming in, emergency services. There were a whole bunch of issues there that we had with the development. We presented the fact that there was significant community opposition to this development. Part of that was people coming, the number of people who appealed the decision, the number of people who came to the SDAB hearings, and also we presented a petition signed by about 300 people, most of whom were local residents who lived within 3 to 4 kilometers of the lake, who were all opposed to this. And finally, we presented some evidence that had to do with the effect of this development on landowners and real estate values, and we presented the case that this would have a detrimental effect on those values. So what happened? We actually had 9 hours of hearings in front of the SDAB. It was very lengthy, very involved, and that was spread over 3 separate dates. The SDAB came up with their decision on November 20th, 2012, and the decision was that the appeal would be allowed and that the development would be denied. They cited a number of reasons for their decision. They said that the developer had given inadequate assurances that the water quality in the lake would be protected. They said that the Parkland County really needs to look and reevaluate their planning policies to ensure that not only this development, but future developments can ensure the future sustainability of the lake. They talked about the inadequate assurances on control of the development, which is one of the issues that we had pointed out. They had some concerns over traffic, the amount of traffic and the type and the densities. They mentioned the strong community support, and they also mentioned that the community had expressed a desire for improvements in policies, especially with respect to environmental issues. And then they also cited the issue of the impact on property values. So overall, we were extremely pleased with this outcome. Not only did the county say that there were problems with the proposal as it stood, but they also were giving advice to Parkland County to say, you don't have a good framework here for making these decisions because your legislation is out of date, and therefore you need to look at updating it. What's the status now? Well, the current status is that the proponent has appealed this decision of the SDAB to the Alberta Court of Appeals. And there's already been one hearing. There will be a continuation of that on May the 7th. In front of the Court of Appeals, they have it's called a right to appeal hearing. And a right to appeal hearing is a single judge, and the single judge decides whether or not the case has enough merit to go before the actual Court of Appeals. So it's a multi-stage process, and we will definitely be at this hearing on May the 7th. So a lot of work, a lot of effort by, I like to point there, a small group of people. We have a lot of people that are supportive. We had a reasonably small group of people that did a lot of work on this. What did we learn? Well, we learned a number of things. We learned that it's important to know the legislation. The developer made the assertion that his proposal there was no conflict with with county legislation, and actually that assertion was backed up by the administration in the county. We respectfully disagreed with that and pointed out a number of ways how there were conflicts with the existing legislation. We also learned clearly that, something that I'm sort of preaching to the converted here, but networking is so important with the scientific community, with other watershed management groups, with our WPAC, with all levels of government. Very, very important to understand how other people can help you. We also learned through this process, it's a fast learning curve, that lake stewardship is a long-term process. We started out as a one-issue group, but we very clearly understand now that if we want to meet our goal, which is to have Mayatan Lake be in good shape, not only for now, but 50 years from now, that we've got some long-term work to do. And I think what was gratifying to us is that you find that you can make a difference if you work hard and try to put an effort into it. The issue, so those are all the good things. The issue that we struggle to understand throughout this process is to get our heads around the whole issue of who is responsible for healthy lakes in Alberta. So I was interested in Mr. Huey's remarks this morning on the issue of monitoring. He talked about putting an integrated resource management system in place. GOA is accountable, partners are valued, orderly transition, provide understanding of mandates and roles. And those four things we struggle with in this issue of responsibility for healthy lakes. So who are the players? Federal government, fisheries and navigation responsibilities. They didn't really have an active discussion with us about this lake, although they had some comments to make. The province, and I have these words that I've taken out of the Water for Life webpage. It says they have primary jurisdiction, they're accountable for implementation, they administer water and watershed management activities. Municipalities. Now I understand that municipalities have some responsibility and authority over water and lakes and rivers within their jurisdiction, but our view and it seemed to us that the municipality, in this case Parkland County, was more focused on the issues of development than on the issues of watershed management. So municipalities have a large influence on what happens to lakes because they're responsible for the land development around the lake. Parkland County does have good environmental policies, but as I said, watershed management is really competing with that issue of land development. The other players, the Alberta Water Council, and again these are words from the website, monitors and stewards the implementation and the strategy, advises government, stakeholders and the public, not-for-profit group. The WPACs, independent, non-profit, they assess the condition of the watershed, prepare plans, seek consensus. These are all pretty soft words. Then you come down to groups like ours, and it says that a Watershed Stewardship Group is a volunteer-based partnership, which we are, certainly, and they take community-level action. So you start at the top and say that the government is accountable for water in Alberta. But it seems to us, as we tried to understand all the players, that the implementation below that accountability is volunteer. And we also find that the mechanisms and the processes that you're supposed to follow, they aren't always clear. And in some cases, I would make the case that maybe the mechanisms don't actually exist. We find funding is being a problem. We got some funding, and we're very grateful about that from the ASN. We also had some contributed work done, which was also appreciated. But for a small group like ours, funding is really a difficult issue. So the result of all this is I never did meet that person, I never did meet that group that says, here's how you manage lakes in Alberta and this is how I can help you. You really are kind of on your own. You have to get out and network with folks like you to understand how things are done. But at the end of the day, I think we're still not totally clear on what it is we're supposed to do and how we go about doing it. So, you know, a simple example, how do we implement a watershed management plan if we are successful in developing one? Particularly if it involves requirements for change in legislation at the county level, as Leah was referring to, if we want to incorporate some of the aspects of the watershed management plan into an area structure plan. How do we go about doing that? How do we make a linkage? How do we get who approves that plan? So we see that there's a bit of a gap. The municipalities on one side, they're very focused, and rightly so, on the issues around land development. The province has responsibilities for environmental protection. Where in that issue who's the group that's looking after the water quality and making sure that it happens? And how can we as a lake stewardship group, and how can others effectively bridge that gap? So I just like to end with a few questions that we have. These are the questions that occur to us. Again, how do we, if we're successful in developing a watershed management plan, how do we implement it? What are the steps that we go through? Who do we get approval from? How do we get the province and the county talking? How do we get all of the players involved in an effective way? And more generally, how can this process, and especially for lakes, because that's what we're focused on, how can it be made more transparent, and how can it be made more effective? And the last question, which is certainly related, is if there are gaps, and maybe there are not gaps, but we perceive there to be gaps between the role that various levels of government play and other players, how can we effectively bridge them in a way that results in healthy lakes? So I don't have answers, but those are the questions that occurred to us through this process.